And as a carpenter, you would expect that he would know a thing or two about different kinds of wood and lumber and the uses to which that wood could be used. He would have known about the trees from which those pieces of lumber were taken. And he would have known about how they grew. And given that Jesus was indeed a carpenter with a certain expertise in this area, I really have to wonder, why did he tell his disciples the parable of the mustard seed? Because you see, any good carpenter, any carpenter worth his salt, living at that time in that place would have known very well that the best lumber to use for anything was the lumber that came from the forests that grew about 200 miles to the north of Galilee in the country of Lebanon. There towered the mighty cedars of Lebanon. Each individual tree could grow to be 130 feet tall. 8 feet around were the trunks. And the cedars of Lebanon grow so tall and straight that the lumber was prized for building ships and palaces and temples. Any good carpenter would have known that. I'm sure a poor carpenter like Jesus didn't get the opportunity very often to work with quality lumber like that. But he would have known about it. But when Jesus had a chance to talk about the kingdom of God and what it was like, he could have taken the image of a cedar of Lebanon. The prophets of old, the people of the Old Testament, often spoke about a cedar of Lebanon as a symbol of God's people and what God wanted them to do on earth. They were like the towering cedars. That's exactly what Ezekiel wrote in the prophecy that we read this morning. The people of Israel, like a towering cedar. But when Jesus came to talk about the nature of the kingdom of God, he chose not to talk about that kind of tree or the wood that came from it. Instead, he chose to speak about what he called the mustard tree. And see, the fact of the matter is, you can't even really call a mustard plant a tree. At best, it might be a bush or a shrub. Now, it is true that there is a certain variety of mustard, the black mustard, that was quite common in the Palestine of Jesus' time, and a black mustard, the shrub, can grow about 9 feet tall. 9 feet tall, that's pretty impressive for a mustard plant. But you put that up against the 130-foot tall cedar of Lebanon, you're not going to impress anyone. So why on earth did Jesus choose to speak about the lowly mustard plant? Now, of course, most of the people listening to Jesus tell this parable were not carpenters themselves. Most of them we know by studies from that time, most of them would have worked in agriculture. They worked out on the fields of Galilee and Judea. So I think it's worthwhile asking, well, what did farmers at that time think about mustard plants? How did they see that seed and what grew out of it? Well, that's something we actually don't have to wonder about. We can know exactly what they thought about mustard plants at that time and that place. Because at about the same time that this Gospel of Mark was written, there was somebody, a Roman author who we know as Pliny the Elder, who sought to compile all the information that anybody had in the world at that time about the natural world. And he put together all of this information in a book that he called the Encyclopedia of Natural History. And it was a very popular book at that time. But it was published at the same time as the Gospel of Mark, more or less. Well, in his natural history, his Encyclopedia of Natural History, Pliny the Elder actually included an entry on the mustard plant. And this is what Pliny wrote in his book. With its pungent taste and fiery effect, mustard is extremely beneficial for the health. It grows entirely wild, though it is improved by being transplanted. But on the other hand, when it has once been sown, it's scarcely possible to get the place free of it, as the seed, when it falls, germinates at once. Now, Pliny saw himself as merely cataloging the known information about the world in his encyclopedia. So this is basically what everybody knew about mustard plants. So I think it's fair to assume that most of the people in the crowd that day listening to Jesus speak about the mustard would have seen the mustard seed and the plant that grew from it in exactly the same way as Pliny. That is to say, they would have seen it as a rather useful spice, something to add a little bit of taste to your food. They also would have seen it as a useful medicine for various cures, but they also understood very clearly that it was a dangerous plant. And that once it got into your garden, even only a little bit of it, it would spread like crazy, and it would take the whole place over. So as I say, Jesus knew his woods. He knew that you could build great and beautiful things out of the tree of a cedar of Lebanon. He knew about the biblical tradition of comparing the people of God and the work that they would do to a mighty cedar of Lebanon. And he must have known how people in his audience thought about mustard seeds and the plants that grew about them. So why on earth, when he wanted to describe the kingdom of God and what it was like, why did he choose not to speak about a mighty tall cedar of Lebanon? Why did he choose to speak about a lowly mustard seed and the shrub that grew from it instead? Well, I have a few ideas. For one thing, I think Jesus had a certain understanding of what would happen after he was gone. And he knew that his disciples would go on and they would seek to build what we've come to call the church. And of course, the church would necessarily start out small and seemingly insignificant, but in time it would grow. And it would become an institution within society with power and influence. Was Jesus looking forward to the heights to which the church that would bear his name would attain in the Western world? Was he thinking about the great cathedrals that would dot the cities of Europe? The popes who would lead armies in the name of God? Was he thinking about the political strength of the religious right in the United States? Was he thinking about all of that? Because if that's what he was thinking of, if that's what he thought that his followers would build, if that's what he thought that they should strive for, I think he probably would have chosen the image of the towering cedar of Lebanon, tall, impressive, overbearing. And he would have said, that's the goal. But Jesus didn't do that. He chose not to speak about the mighty cedar of Lebanon, but about the lowly mustard seed. Now, he was still speaking of something that would grow and spread, but not so much vertically, not so much majestically, but in another way. How did a mustard seed spread? Well, we've already seen that. This is what Pliny wrote in his book. When a mustard seed has been sown, it is scarcely possible to get the place free of it, as the seed, when it falls, germinates at once. So there is no question that this plant is a weed, and it spreads like a weed. And it's hard to control because it is a weed. And imagine that. Here Jesus is seeking to compare the kingdom of God to what everyone in the crowd understood was a weed. I mean, can you imagine those farm workers in the crowd and how they reacted to this parable of Jesus? I mean, they probably hated this plant. They cursed it every time they saw it growing up between their rows of barley and wheat. How many hours had they spent pulling every stalk of mustard out of the ground? They cursed it over and over again. And yet, all the same, they must have had a certain grudging respect for the mustard plant. Oh, that thing could spread. Oh, it was tenacious. And it was to that grudging respect that Jesus was speaking with this parable. And he was saying, that's what the kingdom of God is like. And it grows wherever the seeds fall on the ground. Now there's one other rather odd thing about this parable of Jesus, and that's the whole business about the birds. This is what Jesus says about mustard plants. It says that a mustard shrub puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. And of course it is true that mustard shrubs and plants do attract the birds. And it is true that sometimes birds will make nests in the larger mustard shrubs. But when you think about it, that's not really the primary place you would imagine birds building their nests. I mean, if you were a bird, where would you want to build your nest? Ideally, in a tall, strong tree where you're sheltered from all your enemies, a nice, tall cedar in the mountains. The ideal place for a nest isn't really in a mustard bush. And of course, that's exactly what we read this morning in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. He says, under a cedar tree, every kind of bird will live. In the shade of its branches will nest winged creatures of every kind. That makes perfect sense when you're talking about a cedar tree. It makes perfect sense there in the book of Ezekiel. It doesn't make so much sense when Jesus speaks in exactly the same way about mustard shrubs in the Gospel of Mark. Here's the thing about the birds. It is true that a mustard plant will attract birds. It will attract dozens and dozens and scores of birds. But the thing is, it doesn't attract the birds because they are looking for a place to build their nests. Not primarily. Well, the birds love mustard plants. Why? Because they love the seeds. And they descend upon the mustard plants in their flocks and they devour the mustard seeds. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why the mustard seeds spread so far and wide, why the weed is so quick to spread. Because you see, when the birds fall on the branches and start eating the seed, what happens? Well, naturally, some of those seeds are going to get lodged in their feathers. And then when the birds fly away, those seeds will fall off and they will fall on the ground. And so the seed of the mustard plant is spread far and wide. And not only that, but when the birds eat the seeds, a few of the seeds survive the trip through the bird's digestive tract. And they also fall to the ground in the manner in which birds are beloved everywhere. And those seeds, they also will grow. And it is precisely because of the way in which the mustard plant feeds the birds that the seeds spread so far. That's one of the reasons why the plant is such a terrible, terrible weed. It's so hard to get rid of. But the thing is, the curious thing about that is that for the farmers, for the agricultural workers, standing in the crowd listening to Jesus tell this parable, they would have seen that in a very negative light. Because you need to understand that birds were the great pests of first century agriculture in Palestine. The last thing a farmer wanted to see was dozens of birds landing in his garden and eating the seeds. Birds were pests. They were vagabonds. They just ate. They came and they ate whatever they could get and they left ruin in their wake. Farmers did not want to see birds. Oh, they were fine if they were far away, building their nests in the cedars in the mountains. But you did not want to see a bird in your garden. And that's precisely one of the reasons why Pliny warns people not to plant mustard seeds in their gardens. So this would have been seen very negatively by the agricultural workers in the crowds. They hated the birds. And yet Jesus chose to put emphasis on the way the mustard seeds feed the birds. I think what he was saying was, this was a reference to how the kingdom of God spread as well. That one of the ways in which the kingdom of God spreads upon earth is by ministering to those outcasts, those vagabonds, those outsiders of our society. One of the ways that the kingdom of God spreads is by taking care of those and giving to those who can give nothing in return. And I know this is often seen as a negative thing in the life of the church, because we don't like that. When we talk about the people to whom we minister, when we talk about setting up a new ministry, for example, the first thing that people want to know is, well, what will the church get out of it? What will the church get out of this new ministry? And if that new ministry does not bring new people into the church who will sit in the pews and will contribute financially to the life of the church, often that ministry is dismissed or discounted, because the congregation will get nothing back out of it. Often people look down, for example, on ministry to children and youth. Why? Because kids don't have any money. They can't contribute. People look down on ministry to the poor or to the immigrant community. They will not contribute. And you can spend a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of resources in the life of the church reaching out to people in the community who will appreciate all you do for them, but who will never darken the door of your church on a Sunday morning. And people think it's wasted. Wasted effort. You can spend time building up people, training them, educating them, and then they leave. They go someplace else, or they minister in another church, or they do other things in the world, and it seems like there's nothing coming out of that seed that you've sown. Wasted resources. Jesus never would have seen it like that, because Jesus understood that that is exactly how the kingdom of God spreads. By ministering to people who can give nothing back, who can have nothing to offer to the church. They come and they eat and they are fed, and you know what happens? A few seeds get caught in their feathers. Or a few seeds pass through their digestive tract and they're off and they're gone. And we never see the seed fall to the ground, and so we think it's wasted, but it's not. Because sooner or later that seed will fall to the ground. And it will grow. And amazing things will come from it, and that is how the kingdom of God spreads. That is how the kingdom of God grows. And of course it's true that often the congregation that sows the seed gets none of the benefit. But that doesn't mean that it's wasted. In that growth, in the resulting growth, we see the true nature of the kingdom of God. Will you take a few moments now in silent reflection? Loving God, when we put all our energy in the life of the church into being big and strong and impressive like a cedar of Lebanon, rebuke us. Tell us that these are not our primary goals. But when we are busy sowing the seed, and maybe especially sowing the seed in the lives of people who can give nothing in return, remind us that we are definitely doing the work of the kingdom.